Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on defending your organization against modern botnet attacks. I'm Leslie Denson, and I'm here with Tim Wickman, a senior systems engineer at Ixia, who will talk to you today about strengthening your organization's defenses and preventing malicious activities. Two quick items before we get started. We will be taking questions at the end, but if you have one during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask, and we'll be aggregating those to answer at the end. Also, after the webinar, you will have the opportunity to download and receive these slides. You'll get that, like I said, once the webcast has concluded. With that, Tim, I'll turn it over to you to get started.
All right. Thank you very much, Leslie. Thanks again for everyone who's attending's time today. Hopefully we can pass along some good information about botnets and how to defend against them through today's discussion. The things that I wanted to cover today include a few items. First of all, I wanted to go into some description of how botnets work and how there are really three phases to a botnet's life cycle. Those are propagation, how they spread and how they grow; command and control, how the master of that botnet sends commands and controls that botnet; and then the attack itself. And we'll talk quite a bit about each of those three phases of the botnet's life cycle. Then we'll talk about the history of botnets and how they've evolved over time, how they've progressed in various ways. And then finally, how do you simulate a botnet on your network in order to help harden your defenses and make sure that they don't cause too many problems on your network. So first, just a quick definition of botnets. First, I like this quote from Mark Fossey at Symantec, and he says that botnets are the Swiss Army knife of attack tools. And if you think about those three phases of a botnet's life cycle, the propagation, the command and control, and the attack itself, there are so many different combinations of those that you can put together that it really is almost infinite possibilities for what your botnet looks like and what it can do. To give a little better definition, botnets, as you see on the left, they're typically large networks of typically infected computers that are remotely controllable and used for typically illicit activities, such as you see on the right. You can do DDoS, which is probably the most common usage for them, phishing and spam campaigns. You can do theft of various things, identity theft, financial information, confidential information, propagate malware, click fraud, and others that aren't even on there. You can do scans for vulnerable hosts to make your botnet even larger or plan future botnets, various other things. So you probably noticed that threw in typically quite a bit in that definition. And the reason is they don't have to be large networks. Could be just two computers in a botnet, technically. They're typically infected, but a lot of times, and we'll get to some of the positive or neutral sort of white hat or gray hat activities that you could do with a botnet. They're not always infected, and they're not always used for illicit activities. And some of those gray or white hat activities that you can do, probably the most common, you're all well aware, if you have a search engine and you want to index the web, you might have bots that would go out and crawl the web, various websites, spider those websites, scrape information off of those websites to improve your index and improve your search results. So that would be very much a white hat activity. There are also chat bots, and we'll talk from time to time through this about IRC, Internet Relay Chat. And for those who aren't familiar with it, it dates way back, a few decades ago. It's kind of the predecessor to instant messaging and maybe to a lesser extent even social networking. But through IRC, you would log into a particular channel that was dedicated to a particular topic, and you could send messages back and forth and discuss that topic. And so chatbots, one of the first, actually the first use of a bot, I think, was a chatbot that might be used for mischievous activity. Maybe you create a chatbot to take over someone else's channel, sort of commandeer the conversation or block the discussion, block someone's input into the discussion, or more AI-ish, more recent AI-ish botnets that are bots that would go into these chat rooms and look very similar to an actual person joining the discussion when it's actually just an algorithm, a program that's running to appear to be an actual user. Another interesting use more recently, actually I think late last year, was the Carnet botnet. And for those who aren't familiar with that, this was an anonymous, I think he's still anonymous, security researcher who his goal was to scan the entire IPv4 address space as quickly as he could. By his calculations, with a standard PC running, maybe 10 scans per second, that would take years, I think as much as 15 years to scan the entire V4 address space. So to speed that up, why don't I create a botnet? And he went out and he found over 400,000 PCs and routers that were either using no password or the default password for that device. Very easily was able to take control of those and upload a small telnet scanner, a binary telnet scanner, that using those 400,000 plus bots in his botnet, he dropped his time to scan the entire V4 address space down to along the lines of 15 minutes instead of 15 years. So he used that to create something called the Internet Census 2012, kind of an interesting report that showed the number of V4 address spaces in use and what domains they fall into, and various other pieces of data. But the idea there is it's not all illicit activity, but very typically, especially in the common usage, a botnet is used for malicious activity, as you see on the right. How does a botnet work? So this splits it up into 5 steps, and the first step is really the propagation that I've mentioned. That propagation being, in this case, the BeMaster is the red guy with the eye patch, and he's spreading his botnet using Trojanized software, typically malware, maybe taking advantage of client-side exploits in your browser or your PDF reader, and he's infecting vulnerable computers, as you see with the frowny green face. Steps 2 through 4 really go into the command and control. In step 2, the bots connect to, in this case, an IRC server for centralized command and control. We'll get into some decentralized command and control later, but they would log into these IRC channels and look for commands sent into the IRC channel by the BeMaster and parse those and turn those into some sort of a command to start a SymFlood or start a spam campaign or what have you. Step 3 is where the spammer comes in. Once the BeMaster has a sufficiently large botnet, he may advertise that botnet for use, either for rental or outright purchase. We'll get into later a new business, fairly new business model of actually selling the tools to build your own botnet rather than renting a botnet or selling it. But in this case, the spammer, the sort of the orange face, is talking to the BeMaster, and he arranges a deal to rent the botnet for his use. And in step 4, he sends the commands through the IRC channel, either directly or indirectly through the BeMaster. And then step 5, the botnet starts sending its millions of emails to its victims. And we'll talk about each of these 3 phases and get into how to simulate each of those 3 phases in just a bit. Stepping into a history of botnets. So this slide goes into a little bit of a description there. Early 90s is when we first started to see traditional IRC bots. An example is EggDrop, and it's pretty amazing, but more than 20 years later, EggDrop is still in active development, still evolving. In the late 90s, you started to see denial of service tools, as you see here, Trinu, TFN, Shackledraw, and others. And you started to see peer-to-peer technology raised its head. So this was really more for file sharing, not necessarily for botnet use, but the general concept came to the fore in the late 90s. You're probably familiar with Kazaa, Napster, those kind of guys. Then in 2000, around 2000, you started to see worm or self-propagating botnets and rootkit technology start to be used in these botnets. And you started to see IRC-controlled bots incorporating those DDoS techniques that we mentioned from the late 90s. Another watershed, or really probably the biggest watershed moment, was in 2000, the DDoS attacks against Amazon and Yahoo, eBay, etc., by Mafia Boy, who was, at the time, I think he was a kid in Canada, who decided to launch these DDoS attacks, which brought these large e-commerce sites down for unknown hours and cost unknown numbers of dollars in goodwill for these companies. It's really where DDoS came to the fore in sort of the public consciousness, and where botnets just started to gain some traction in terms of being known by the average user. In the mid-2000s, you started to see peer-to-peer controlled bots. So you started to see the incorporation of these peer-to-peer ideas into the command and control structure of bots. So here you shift from a centralized command and control structure. Maybe it's IRC, maybe it's moved on to more modern HTTP, DNS, even Twitter, instant messaging are being used for them now. But in the mid-2000s, you started to see peer-to-peer command and control. And this made it difficult just from the sense of takedown of these botnets. If you have one server and all of the command and control data is going through that server, you just bring that server down through a number of different methods and you shut down the botnet. But if it's peer-to-peer, that becomes much harder to do. In this time frame, you're still talking fairly small scale. I think Agobot was a well-known one in the mid-2000s, but it was along the lines of several hundred. I think most reports had it around 500 hosts, and you'll see on the next slide that's just a drop in the bucket compared to current botnets. You also started to see polymorphic botnets. So a lot of this you can see parallels malware in general, the evolution of malware in general, but polymorphic botnets would change appearance as often as possible to avoid detection. And then the last bullet there, late 2000s up until today, is when you saw very large-scale botnets, and they were built almost purely for illicit activities, as you saw in the previous slide. You can see on this slide how large these botnets can scale. So I mentioned Agobot being 500 hosts. Now we're talking 30 million. The top three, and this is according to Wikipedia, the top three were over 10 million hosts. Burrito Lab was used a loader for scareware or fake antivirus. Some of these pop-ups that say you're infected, buy this product and we'll clean your system, or even ransomware. We've got control of your system, and you've got to wire money to this account, or you won't be able to control your system. And Burrito Lab, 30 million hosts. It was pretty huge at its peak. Zeus actually was a different business model. Zeus, you could buy the tools to build your own Zeus botnet. So it was multiple botnets, and I'm not sure if this 3.6 million is the total for all those botnets or if it was just the largest of those botnets. Another way to look at how large these can scale is in terms of their traffic generating capability. You've seen enormous DDoS attacks launched via these botnets, some as much as, according to some figures, 300 gigabits of traffic. Or one of the botnets we'll look at in just a few minutes is Pushdo, aka Cut Whale, and that was a spam generating botnet that, according to some reports, was doing anywhere from 74 billion spam messages a day. Some even said as much as 180 billion. Just an enormous amount of traffic that they can generate, and all of the problems that come with that amount of traffic for users and service providers and others. So how do botnets spread? This slide goes into some of those. Typically, social engineering is the start of it. Maybe you receive an email with a link in it, and one of the botnets we'll show later uses this technique. You click on that link, you're taken to a website that either takes advantage of a vulnerability in your browser, runs some script, or maybe just convinces you to download and run some executable file, some malicious executable file. So a lot of it begins with social engineering and tricking people into going to sites they shouldn't go to and executing files and opening attachments they shouldn't. Some of these take advantage of publicly disclosed vulnerabilities. Some even take advantage of zero-day vulnerabilities, although that's fairly rare for botnets to do that. We will talk about one example of that later. And then the last one, it's really dwarfed, exponentially in terms of the amount of this really being a threat, but supply chain is becoming interesting. Microsoft did a study, a very small sample, but they purchased 20 PCs in the open market in China, and their concern was counterfeit Windows and the amount of revenue they lose as a result of counterfeit OSs. And these 20 PCs, turned out all 20 of them had a counterfeit OS, and these were from recognizable but unnamed brands, is how they put it. So they didn't name the brands of PCs they bought, but apparently fairly big names. More interesting, though, from for our discussion today, 4 out of those PCs, 4 out of those 20, or 20%, had malware pre-installed. So we'll get to, I think on the next slide, we'll talk about some of the steps you can take to avoid them, but no matter what you do, in terms of avoiding these botnets, you may be infected and made part of these botnets right out of the box from your PC. So how do you prevent and mitigate botnets? There's a number of different ways, and I'll touch on a few of these. First, education. If done well, it can be the most effective, but it's a little bit tricky. You're basically training users to be skeptical, be paranoid in a way of opening files and making sure they trust the sources of various data on the internet, various sites and emails and so on. The second way to prevent them is through patching. I mentioned that many of these are taking advantage of older vulnerabilities, sometimes several years, patched several years ago. So keeping up to date on your patching is sort of a simple and very effective way of avoiding becoming part of these botnets. In the past, a lot of these were taking advantage of vulnerabilities at the OS level. So you were reliant on Microsoft and their Patch Tuesday packages to prevent you, to patch up these problems. Microsoft has gotten so aggressive and so effective at addressing these vulnerabilities and making it very easy to keep your systems up to date with these patches that I think the focus has shifted more to the applications, the client-side applications, like your PDF reader, Java, Flash, JavaScript. All these are becoming more and more the target for a lot of these vulnerabilities. But even they are starting to become more effective at patching these vulnerabilities and making it easier to patch these as a user. You can disable apps, which to varying degrees can be painful on the internet and limit your enjoyment of the internet. You can disable Java, although from my experience it immediately kills WebEx, so you wouldn't be able to run this this web conference we're doing right now. Flash, you can disable that with a little less discomfort. There was a big push away from Flash a few years ago. I think that momentum has stopped and maybe shifted back the other way because there's still quite a bit of content out on the web that's Flash-based. Pretty much can't turn off JavaScript without really breaking the functionality of most websites. They're so heavily reliant on JavaScript, but that's a possibility as well. Inspection of traffic. If you're an enterprise or a service provider, you can, or even an end user, you can use network or host-based anti-malware products, IPS, data loss prevention, spam filtering products, those sorts of things to inspect for the traffic on your network and find one or more of those 3 phases of propagation, command and control, and attack. The next bullet is becoming more prevalent, and it's very interesting, collaboration and takedown. So, the first example there is to take down the DNS changer botnet, which basically went in and altered your DNS configuration on your system so that when you go to a website, you go to the wrong place, using someone else's, the BeMaster's DNS servers, he would redirect you to the wrong place to grab your banner advertisements on a particular website or that sort of thing, and obviously be able to profit from that. So what the FBI did in Operation Ghost Click was they got a court order allowing them to set up good DNS servers to temporarily replace the bad DNS servers. That resulted in a number of arrests, and basically they were able to shut down the DNS changer botnet that way. There's a couple different methods. One is, as we just discussed, command and control tracking and takeover. Another example there is Zeus. Microsoft, again, or Microsoft went through the courts to take control of several hundred domains and servers to shut down the Zeus botnet. Or you can do sinkholing. And the second bullet there under collaboration and takedown is where Microsoft Digital Crimes Unit, a good example of sinkholing is there's a Chinese web hosting firm called 3322.org that, according to Kaspersky Labs, according to their estimates, 40% of malware was connecting to a domain or a website that was hosted by 3322.org at some point during its life cycle. So Microsoft and their digital crimes unit, which has gotten more and more active, they diverted DNS requests for a number of the subdomains that were being hosted by 3322.org, sending the requests to their own servers and thereby blocking the command and control traffic. So a lot of promise there in collaboration and takedown, but you can imagine it can take some time. You know, the FBI, Microsoft Digital Crimes Unit, working your way through the courts, those sorts of things to do some of this takeover and sinkholing can slow that down. A little more detail on inspecting traffic. You know, an IPS or IDS could look for malicious JavaScript on a wire. It may have signatures to match that malicious JavaScript. Here's an example of an Agabot snort rule. So one of those older botnets. You could use, some of these devices could use heuristic and look for maybe a whole lot of communication to a specific uncommon port. An example of that, presumably you could block that port and shut down that command and control. The XR botnet from several years ago, all of its command and control activity was on UDP 3074. So it was as simple as blocking UDP 3074 if that was reasonable, and you'd shut down that botnet. Or you could use a next-gen firewall that can recognize applications accurately and use that to shut down either the command and control or the attack itself by using signatures for known botnets or application control. You know, you could, if you have a next-gen firewall, you're an enterprise, IRC may not be needed, so you can just block all IRC communication or block Twitter or Gmail or some of the other command and control applications to shut them down that way. Data leak prevention, some of these bots might leak information, tax ID numbers, credit card numbers. You could look for the string confidential, those sorts of things. So now that we've talked about how botnets work and how they've evolved over the years, how do you test and harden your network against these botnets? And here at Ixia, we think Breaking Point is the best platform for doing this because of its ability to generate a mix of real attack traffic, including over 30,000 pieces of malware, which is typically how they're spread, real-world applications, over 200 real-world applications, including a lot of the protocols we've mentioned, IRC, HTTP, obviously, DNS, peer-to-peer, instant messaging. So you can simulate that traffic using the Breaking Point system. And you can do all that with a very high level of performance, which is typically needed to simulate a very large-scale botnet, especially if it's doing a DDoS or a very large spam campaign. If you're wanting to simulate a lot of that traffic at once, you can see some of the numbers here that in a single chassis can be generated using the Breaking Point product. So very scalable in that sense. So how would I use Breaking Point to simulate these botnets? We make it very easy. First of all, through some pre-built botnet simulations. And one of the things I didn't mention on that previous slide, that list of attacks and malware and the list of protocols that Breaking Point can simulate is updated every 2 weeks through what we call a strike pack update. And through these strike pack updates, we've also started to add various simulations of botnet activity. So you can see some of the examples here. The Cut Whale Push Dough botnet, again, very large spam generation. Zeus and Spy Eye were both used for theft of financial information. Zero Access is one that pretty heavily geared for click fraud and I think Bitcoin mining. And Dooku was a worm-based botnet that actually did use a mix of zero-day vulnerabilities in Word along with some attacks on industrial control systems, and it was related to Stuxnet, if any of you are familiar with that. So sort of the assumption is it's nation-to-nation espionage that's being done with Dooku and Stuxnet. So we make these pre-built with no knowledge of any of these particular botnets or very, very little knowledge required of the Breaking Point product. You can run these botnet simulations. So to that end, let me pull up the Breaking Point interface. And just to show you, this is in my browser. If I go through the breaking point user interface and I look at a list of tests, I can just search very quickly for botnet, and you can see a number of pre-built botnets. They all have the padlock icon next to them, and botnets that were created, botnet tests that were created using by individual users. So we'll drill into the pushdo botnet. So let me open that up. And in this pre-built test, all of this is already done for you. We've set up the network neighborhood, which specifies your hosts, both your bots and your command and control servers and your victims of this botnet. We've set up the test components, and you can see here a long list of test components. Using these, we can generate anywhere from layer 2 Ethernet frames all the way up to layer 7 application traffic, as you see here with application simulator. And we've got an application simulator component in this test that's going to generate 100,000 flows per second, 20 gigabits of traffic, 100,000 concurrent flows using 130,000 odd hosts. So again, pre-built and ready to go. If I go over to what we call Application Manager, I can see a little bit more of the detail of what's going on in those flows. So in Application Manager, I'll search for pushdo cut whale, and within this view, we'll be able to see what traffic is going to be generated at the application layer throughout this. So in this case, I won't go through each one of these flows, but this superflow is made up of one or more protocols, and in this case, it's HTTP, it's some DNS, some SMTP, and each one of these protocols that's in here, you can have one or more flows of each protocol, and each flow you can set individual actions for that flow. So it's kind of a hierarchy. Your superflows are made up of flows, and your flows are made up of actions. And you can go into each individual action and see more detail, each individual flow, and set various parameters on them, each individual action, set parameters. In this case, with pushdo, the potential or the bots are going out and doing GET requests for retrieving an update, updates and modules to their spam software. And in this case, it's grayed out here since it's a pre-built test, but you can see I can specify in Application Manager a host of settings, header values and HTTP versions, cookie settings. In this case, what's critical is the request path, /40, E8, etc. This is what the bots are going to request. And in the pushdo botnet, what this is going to include, embedded in this string that's being requested, is a unique bot ID so that the BeMaster knows who he's talking to and who he's getting this information from, and whether to encrypt the executable files, the botnet executables, the key that's going to be used for that encryption, and several other pieces of data. So that's just an example of the configurability of the individual actions within these flows and within the flows themselves. So in addition to that, again, I won't go into each individual one, but in addition to requesting and retrieving updates, the bots are then going to request and retrieve spam orders over HTTP. And then the last step is DNS lookups. We'll do some DNS lookups for the mail exchange servers, and we'll simulate the SMTP messages that are the spam messages themselves. So again, all of that very configurable, and all of that very predefined for you and easy to do. So let me go back to our test and our pushdo cut whale test. I modified this slightly and gave it a new name, and I'll open up that test just to speed it up. I didn't want you guys to have to sit here for a half an hour while the test goes through these various phases. I also scaled it up to a larger number of hosts. Based on my research, it was a larger number of hosts in the pushdo botnet. So let me pull up the right one here. 1.5 million hosts is what I increased the number of bots to in this case. So if I go ahead and click Save and Run, this test will initialize. And while the test is running, it's going to run fairly quickly, but we'll get a summary tab that'll show us TCP layer, application layer, and interface stats, bits per second and frames per second. We can drill down on those interface stats through the interface tab. We can drill down on the TCP sessions per second and state diagram on this TCP tab. Or we can go over here to the application tab and see on a per protocol basis what's being generated. So right now we're 9 seconds, 10 seconds into the test, and we're generating purely HTTP. So we're getting those updates and modules for the bots. We're also probably at this point requesting the instructions from the BotMaster to start the spam campaign. And now we're starting to see the DNS lookups at this point, about 25 seconds in, for those mail servers. And I think within the next couple of seconds, we'll start to see, there we go, the SMTP line starts to light up, and we start to see the actual spam messages being generated at very high rate. So that's, again, very simple to set up. I just tweaked a couple of things just to make the test run faster, but it's really set up for someone who doesn't know, hasn't done a lot of research on a particular botnet, but they want to simulate it and test various devices on their network and the ability to block or mitigate various aspects of that botnet. So let's go back to our slides here. So this goes into that hierarchy, which I've already gone over, so I'm going to skip through that. But you've got application profiles, which are mixes of protocols. You can see mail, NFS, SSH, and various others in this application profile. Then we've got an SMTP superflow, which is really made up of DNS lookups, followed by the SMTP traffic. And then you've got various actions within that SMTP superflow. Client connecting, sending receipt, sending data, sending the message itself. And again, all these are very configurable down to the level of, for that message data, I can either simply specify the size of those messages, or I can actually upload files for use in that message data, or upload files for use as attachments to that message data. So what that allows you to do, what that configurability allows you to do through Application Manager and other aspects of the UI, you can build your own botnet. So in addition to the 6 that we have, and those will again expand as we do these Strike Pack updates, we also have the ability to simulate your own or build your own botnet. And I had a request, I think it's been about a year and a half now, for the Zemra botnet, which I'll go into some of the details on. And I went through the exercise of building this botnet for this customer so that they could simulate all aspects of this botnet on their network. So just to give a little background, the Zemra botnet is crimeware. It uses Trojanized software. It opens up a backdoor on the system, all pretty typical behavior, and makes the system part of a botnet. And it affects basically all flavors of Windows that you might see these days. And what you get with that, with this botnet, is it's a little bit different in the sense that this is one where you're buying the package to build your own botnet. So rather than renting a botnet or purchasing an already propagated botnet, you're buying the tools, and this one was made available, the Zemra botnet was made available on the underground for 100 euros. And what you would get for your 100 euros was a package that contained a builder that you could use to generate a botnet executable for the propagation phase, and it would include the command and control server software, web server files, PHP, images, templates, all that would allow you to build this nice control panel that you see here, very easy to use and configure. And maybe hard to read there, but basically what you can do from this control panel, you can select the attack that you want to generate. In this case, he's doing an HTTP flood, but a SYN flood was also possible through Zemra. You choose your target, you choose your time, your start and your end time for your botnet attack, the number of hosts that you would want to use and harness for this HTTP flood, and you can even get more granular and say, give me 1,000 hosts from the United Kingdom if you wanted to maybe get maybe trick someone into thinking that the United Kingdom is hacking China or whatever you wanted to do. So pretty flexible and very easy to set up. You can see here, how does it spread? The idea here is, you don't have to have any security knowledge. You pony up your 100 euros and you can build your own botnet. And this goes into some of the techniques that are used to spread the botnet. You would typically send out a phishing, not really a phishing email, but a spam email with a link to an obfuscated screensaver file. It is designed to look like a PDF file that the user is going to download, but it's really a screensaver file. The command and control would be done over HTTP with a post. Basically, the bots would post system information, and that system information included a number of different things that I think we'll show in a subsequent slide. Again, open up a backdoor to 7710 TCP, use encrypted HTTP for some of the command and control, and the attack in this case, what I built was a SYN flood. This slide shows under the covers what the Zemra code does when it infects a system. Again, pretty typical for malware. It creates some files, deletes some files, modifies some files, does some registry edits to add it to the startup folder, and add it to the authorized list of applications for the built-in Windows firewall to make sure that it doesn't get shut down. And you can see some of the system information that gets plugged into that HTTP post, which we'll simulate as part of our botnet. The computer name, the language settings, Windows version. According to some reports, this evolved later to include much more information, user agents, privilege levels, hardware IDs, number of cores, that sort of thing, so that the BeMaster knew exactly what he had at his disposal for these botnets. And again, what's the goal? Build your own personal botnet without knowing anything about them, and then launch DDoS attacks and use that to extort your targets. So let me cut over again to the Breaking Point UI to show you the Zemra botnet. Again, this test was not pre-built by Breaking Point. I built this test from scratch, and I created a network neighborhood. In this case, I think it was 65,000 bots and 65,000 servers on the other side of the conversation. I used, in this case, not just Application Simulator, but also Session Center. I used our Application Simulator component to simulate the propagation and CNC traffic, and we'll see that a little more detail on that in a moment. And then I used Session Center with a delay while the propagation and command and control occurs. I put a delay in before the Session Center components start to generate a large-scale SYN flood. So again, using a couple of different components, I was able to simulate that. And you're able to put in a description of your test. So basically what this is going to do is simulate the download of a phishing email containing a link to this screensaver file. Let me switch over to Application Manager so some of this will make more sense or be a little more visible. We're also going to simulate the user clicking on that link, presumably, going out to that web page, grabbing that file, and then we're going to simulate the upload of the system information through HTTP post and other command and control traffic, and then we're going to kick off the SYN flood. So here's in Application Manager what this traffic is all going to look like. Again, propagation is going to be over POP3, and within that POP3 traffic, we're going to retrieve an email, and that email, I can, again, configure various aspects of it. I've actually uploaded a file called freeponies.txt that basically is going to be the screensaver file, nicely HTML formatted, nice background colors, make it real enticing to the user to click on that link. And within this, within POP3, you can specify your from and to domains and usernames. So I've specified some of that here. We've got something we call tokens to generate some randomized values, randomized alpha characters to generate our usernames, and various other aspects of this POP3 mail traffic. Then we go into DNS lookups of the command and control server, communication with the command and control server, and a few other things here. Kind of running short on time, so I'll speed through some of this, but you can see some of the other protocols that are being used to generate that traffic. So let me go back to our test and run that so you can see what the Zimra botnet looks like on the wire. And if I save and run, what we're going to have is about 20 seconds of propagation and command and control traffic. So once we're initialized, we'll see fairly low scale traffic as the botnet spreads and gathers up its commands for what it's going to do. And then once the SYN flood kicks in, about 20 seconds into the test, we'll see things scale up pretty quickly. So here you see the POP3 traffic, HTTP, DNS traffic, again, all propagation and command and control. I go to our summary tab, I can see we're generating just 30 TCP connections per second. Now we're jumping up to 3,000, and now into the millions of TCP connections as we start to generate that SYN flood. So now we're doing over 2 million SYN packets per second, or 4.3 gigabits in this case of SYN flood traffic. So that test is winding up. Let me jump back and discuss a little bit about the future of botnets and kind of the direction we see those going. As with all traffic, everything's going mobile, so you're starting to see botnets like the BeMaster botnet, which was a malicious app that was distributed through, a lot of times these mobile malwares are distributed through third-party Android markets. In this case, hundreds of thousands of devices were compromised, and basically it installed this Trojanized app. Was designed to install a remote access Trojan, grab some confidential information off the phone, things like your NCID, your cell ID, your mobile network code, and various other things. And then it would go out and contact premium SMS and telephony numbers along with pay-per-view websites to presumably profit the BeMaster. And according to NC State and Symantec, they did a cooperative report on this that estimated that the BeMaster botmaster or botmasters were bringing in anywhere from $500,000 to $3.3 million in annual revenues. So just to give you a data point on how profitable some of these can be, and this was fairly small scale as we've seen before. Also the MDK botnet. Over 1 million Android phones infected through, in this case, over 7,000 Trojanized apps in third-party Android app stores. So you might think you're getting, Temple Run or Fishing Joy or whatever your favorite application is, but you're also being made a part of the MDK botnet as a result. And you can actually download the APK from the website that I have here. Use that to simulate a very realistic, again, simulation of a mobile botnet as well. Breaking Point products have the ability to simulate mobile traffic as well as wireline traffic. So you can very easily simulate a mobile botnet, propagating, doing its command and control, and generating its attack traffic. So I think that was all we had for now.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, yep. Thank you, Tim. That was a lot of really good information. As he just said, we're going to go ahead and open it up for our Q&A. So if anybody has questions, feel free to go ahead and pop those in the Q&A function of the WebEx, and we'll make sure that they get asked. To start off with, we did have one question. So assuming that the attack phase is a DDoS, how high can Breaking Point actually scale? Tim?
Yeah, I'm sorry. In the example we showed there, I think it was along the lines of 4+ gigabits per second or a couple of million packets per second. Depending on the type of DDoS and the platform, in terms of packets per second, you'll see anywhere from 3 million to 15 million packets per second, which would be line rate 10 gig, 64-byte packets if you wanted to. In terms of connections per second, you could see a stable line of anywhere from 800,000 to 1.5 million TCP connections per second or UDP flows per second. So very large-scale DDoS, and that's on a single blade. So using multiple blades and potentially multiple chassis, you could scale this up to hundreds of gigabits, which we've done in the past, hundreds of gigabits of traffic in a single test.
Fantastic. Another question coming in, what types of malware can Breaking Point simulate?
We have, as I mentioned, over 30,000 samples, and that's a mix of wireline and mobile malware. The wireline malware is typically, your repeat offenders, executable files, screensaver files, as I mentioned, PDFs that might take advantage of client-side vulnerabilities, various others. And those malware samples in the Breaking Point product, you can simulate those going over various transports, web transports, mail transports. You can specify compression algorithms to apply to those malware samples to make them harder to detect by your malware detection products. In terms of mobile malware, we've got over 200, I believe, mobile malware samples to simulate Trojanized software, worms, backdoors on all the major platforms. Obviously Android and iOS, but Symbian and several others as well. So quite a variety, and that mobile malware and the wireline malware continues to grow, again, through those Strike Pack updates every 2 weeks.
Okay. And along those same lines, what if Breaking Point doesn't support the particular type of malware that somebody would like to simulate?
So there's a couple different ways you can do that. You can, through the application manager that we saw earlier, I mentioned that regardless of protocol, you can specify the payload of that protocol by either just specifying the size of that payload or by actually uploading files to the Breaking Point system, and we'll send those back from the server to the client as requested. So you could upload malware that way. You can also update particular malware samples directly into our security engine for use in the security engine, in which case you could apply various evasion techniques on top of that to make it harder to detect, encoding techniques and so on. So a couple different ways you can do it, and that flexibility not only benefits you for botnet simulation, but also just for general testing purposes. There's a lot of different applications where you might want to control that payload traffic or the particular header values, et cetera, within that application layer traffic. And it gives you a lot of flexibility there, not just for security and DDoS and botnet testing, but just for performance testing in general.
Excellent. Well, any other questions? Okay, doesn't look like it. Thank you, Tim, for your time, and then thank you, everyone, for joining today's webcast on defending your networks against modern botnet attacks. We at Ixia thank you for joining, and